Hi, welcome to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
which is kind of fun because I get to somewhat interview my boss.
Well, it could be interesting. We can always flip the table sometime if you want.
Yeah, I think it'll work. So we wanted to talk to everyone today about why we got into science.
Which is a little bit of a dangerous topic because I have to think back a long time now, but we'll see how it goes.
For me, it was just a couple minutes ago. Just started science.
Wait a minute. I thought you were a scientist.
I am, but a lot of people can be scientists. No, I do have a PhD. My transcripts didn't lie, so I wasn't hired under false pretenses.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Well, mine goes back to when I was just a little kid, and I used to go to the library all the time, and I would check out all the books about the solar system. And I was that classic little kid who couldn't get enough of the planets.
This tracks.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Space cadet kind of thing. So when I was in high school, I wanted to learn about how or why everything. I would always ask the question. I was one of those little snotty kids that said, well, why does it happen that way? Why is the sky blue? Why is this? Why is that? And I concluded that the only way for me to satisfy myself was to actually go study all the reasons why things happened. And that's how I ended up in elementary particle physics.
In elementary school? Particle physics?
No. No, but that was
as
just
a career
trajectory. It started with the Legos and the blocks, and that's the elementary particles in which you build up your castles. But ultimately, it was like I want to figure out what the smallest things are. We're getting our first caller.
They're already asking us to stop.
Love it. Anyway, what are your memories
of how I got into science?
Yeah.
I think I was always into a broad variety of topics, but I was always super curious. By the time I graduated high school, I think I had like 6 years of science courses that I had acquired in the 4 years of high school. But my motivation was more I wanted to help people. And I thought science was a really good way to do that where you can... What?
Who told you that science would help people?
Oh, well, I'm a molecular biologist, so I actually try to help people, unlike physicists who just try to confuse them.
Or kill people.
Oh, well, option two. So my motivation was you could be an MD, but then you only help your patients, right? And also I don't like skin conditions, so that was never going to happen. But I thought if I work on human diseases, then I have the potential to reach many more people than I could ever interact with. And so I was driven by like a compassion for humanity and interest in discovery, and then also wanting to teach people very directly. So,
Were there any like gateway publications? Because I remember Scientific American was like super important to me, and I just couldn't wait till the next edition came out. And I remember sitting there. I used to work at a Hyatt hotel, and I would bring the magazines with me, and as a cashier. And when the restaurant was slow, I'd be reading, pretending like I knew what they were talking about in the magazine. But I remember that being very important to me.
I think probably gateway science drug was NPR, Science Fridays. I'm a auditory learner, which is a rare learning type where I learn by hearing. Also a kinesthetic one where I learn by movement. So I'm like the weird person that's dancing and like saying things out loud to learn. But which, really fun to watch. But so listening to Science Friday and things like that really struck me and made me very interested. And then, of course, I got my Scientific American subscription eventually, which has lapsed.
It's probably been about 30 years since I was a subscriber to that magazine. I'm curious, did you have a lot of people around you when you were younger who were like science geeks and nerds? Or
I'm solidly a nerd. There is no question about that. So, yeah, a lot of my friends... Growing up, I have a friend who worked at the Hadron Collider. Well, not while we were children, to be clear. But I have a friend who is an astrophysicist. I have a lot of the people I grew up with. I have PhDs and study science. I don't know, we're this weird little place in Michigan that apparently there's something in the water there. It might have been chemical pollution from a shoe factory, but... turned out a lot of scientists.
Wow, that's actually really cool. I grew up in Woodridge, and I went to Downers Grove South High School, and a lot of the kids I went to school with had parents who were scientists at either Fermilab or Argonne. So I was the black sheep of the family, And right now, most everybody in my family is like a lawyer. So they're like, where'd he come from? This kid who's like studying science. So, but I do see that there's a culture associated with science. And, so I have a lot of lawyers in my family, and I married an MD. So I spent a lot of time hanging around the doctor culture, going to the doctor functions and putting on the clothes, because you have to dress up when you go do doctor stuff.
So you're not talking about like a lab coat, but like a fancy suit.
Well, yeah. It's like, you get invited to dinners. And I remember when Kath was a resident, and that was back in the day when the drug companies could just throw money at doctors.
Oh, yeah.
And
They'd
so,
be like, if you prescribe this, we'll take you to like the Bahamas.
well, I never got to go to the Bahamas, but I certainly got a lot of nice dinners in Columbus, Ohio. So yeah, after Kath got her MD and I got my PhD, we settled in Columbus, and I was working as a postdoc at Ohio State University, and she ended up.
You mean the Ohio
correct.
State?
Actually, thank you, thank you for the correction. I'm sure all of my friends from Ohio State are really pissed at me right now.
I mean, they're gonna like take away your fellowship note on your resume.
They'll make me pay back the salary or whatever.
Yeah.
And then we would get. Kath would just come home and say, hey, we're going to go out to dinner at this really fancy restaurant. Such and such a drug company is paying for all of us to go to dinner. And it's like, okay, let's go. So yeah, there's a whole culture associated with it. And science, physics in particular has a very distinctive culture. And, we were talking about that a little bit earlier. You were talking about how in your discipline, it's driven a lot by wanting to help people. And I can't help but think that a lot of people in the physical sciences, it's less about others and more about just, I'm really curious about how all this stuff works. And so I'm going to really dive into it. And I'm not sure what it's going to be useful for, because I'm not sure I care. It's just, I find this really interesting, so I'm going to do it.
So do you buy into that whole trope that physicists think they're doing it right and mathematicians think that they're doing it right and chemists think they're doing it right, like the hierarchy of how deep and theoretical you want to get, and then biology is a soft science? It's not.
Well, the other thing about it is that physics hasn't really changed in a very, very long time. And it's easiest to see by the textbooks. Right. But I think your discipline is changing almost every year.
Lots of new discoveries.
So they say 20th century was a century for physical sciences, and the 21st century is going to be a life sciences. That's my understanding. And I
would argue it always has been with the life sciences.
But, a lot of it is instrumentation, and a lot of it is what we're capable of doing. I think the world literally changed for the life sciences when, the whole notion of DNA, and that you can actually study somebody's DNA. I mean, before it was just, it exists, but, we're not sure if we're ever going to figure out how to decode it. And then it just literally overnight, all of a sudden, you can do DNA studies, and it gives you an incredible insights. And we were talking the other day in my family about how there are all these animals that look alike, and historically, in zoology and in plant sciences, you would look at physical characteristics to decide what was closely related to what.
Right.
Now you can just study the DNA and say, these things look exactly the same, but they have nothing to do with each other. They independently evolved into the way they look now.
That's actually, the species theory is more complex than that. So how do you figure out that two things are the same species or different species? Because there is no set number of genetic differences that makes that.
But this is why I think it's so interesting, and biology has really taken off, is because there's just so many more interesting ways of thinking about it and looking at it, and data that you can extract. I think of it as astrophysics was a field that exploded in the late 20th century because of all these new instruments.
Right.
And with all of this new available data, we could think about and look at things in ways that we never, ever could before.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Human Genome Project revolutionized everything. Also, we've only known DNA is a double helix since the 1950s. And when they discovered RNA or understood RNA, they're like, meh, just an intermediary. And now, like, RNA is the boss, and I will fight you on that. It is the best molecule. Any day of the week, I will take on anyone who argues against that.
So going back to the whole culture thing, and in the physical sciences, one of the things that I found is, it's kind of a little joke, the fastest way to end a conversation
is to bring up RNA.
No, actually, just say that you're studying physics. So that's what I was going to say, because I found that to be true when I was in college. You'd go to a party and everyone would be talking, and then they'd say, so what are you studying? Oh, I'm studying to be a physicist. And then they would just kind of get quiet and nod their head, and then they would walk away.
See, I feel like a lot of people give the reaction to scientists, oh, you must be smart. But that's not.
They've never met me.
Oh, that's clearly the problem. Yep.
It is.
Yep. No, I think it's a misconception. Anyone can be a scientist. Anyone can get into it. It's a societal fear of science, and I think everyone should know that it's exciting and it's awesome, and anyone can do it, and you're probably all doing it all the time with asking questions about the world.
And this is going to our education. You're an educator. I'm an educator. We've both been in this business for a while, and what you just described is how I think solid science educators go about teaching. And I know when I'm teaching introductory science, I always tell the students, the concept that we're going to talk about now, you probably already understand. You just didn't think about it before. And for example, when we talk about latent heat in liquids, and I always say, you already know that the latent heat of vaporization for water is way more, much, much bigger than the amount of heat necessary to heat it up. And
right.
Because everybody has made pasta before, and that's the example I give. So you take the water, you put it in the pot, you put the pot on the stove, and you're adding heat. You got the burner on, and you know about how long it takes to get the water to the boiling point. And then you leave the pot on, and you put the pasta in, and the water's still boiling, but the water doesn't evaporate right away. It takes 20, 30 minutes for the water to evaporate out of the pot.
Right.
So that's a direct measure of, the amount of the latent heat of vaporization for water. And now what we're doing is we're just simply taking and naming things that you've intuitively learned through your daily life.
Right.
And that's just science.
Yeah. And asking why something does it and then trying to figure it out in a little more detail. It's just how far you're diving or the questions that you learn how to ask because you have the basic information already.
And often I'll tell people, I say, oh, I'm not good at science. And I just said, well, you've probably never had a good teacher.
Yeah. Well, that could be true with not having a good teacher, or it could just be that they are afraid to consider themselves a scientist, even though they may already be one.
So is that a cultural thing? I mean, is it that there's a connotation associated with being a scientist?
I mean, there is a cultural perspective that we are nerds, and I just was perpetuating that.
So, I mean, we could really get into an issue of gender as well. I mean, do people see female scientists different than male scientists?
Historically, certainly. And I would say there's, sexism isn't over.
Not there. Yeah.
And on that note.
I know. Yeah, that's a tough one. But I don't know. I've always found intelligence to be quite sexy, actually.
Oh, my.
No, it's like...
well, who wouldn't?
Well, part of it is I just really enjoy conversing with people. And, if somebody doesn't have a strong intellect, then the conversation doesn't tend to go very far.
Yeah, but I think anyone can build up intellect too over time. It's exposure and experience.
Fair.
Yeah.
Fair. Are you a believer in IQ?
Not in the way we test it, because it's culturally biased.
Yeah.
But, well, I think that it would be great to hear from other people at some point when we start doing interviews about how they got into their career path in science, and everyone has different ideas of that. But I think we've hit our time limit here.
Well, thanks for listening.
Yeah, you've been listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
Thanks, guys.
See you next time.